down a civilian airliner. The president might be able to make that sort of a decision, but the procedures all really are oriented towards something being offshore and being picked up by American interceptors and shadowed, and conversations going on and people having time to make decisions. But to have something veer off path by a few seconds from headed to National Airport and plow into the Pentagon or to the White House, it's very difficult to make that kind of a decision.
Now, as we begin a war effort, clearly the CIA has a role to play in terms of intelligence on the ground.
Yes.
How quickly can the CIA develop human resources inside, let's say, Afghanistan, Pakistan, inside even Osama bin Laden's network?
Most of the time, this takes a long time. The CIA actually did get geared up quite well, as I mentioned earlier, in 1999. And a part of this is working with liaison services, that is, with foreign intelligence services that we trade information with. But it got geared up quite well in 1999 and had some successes. So there are things you can do quickly, but most things, recruiting assets, recruiting agents, takes months to years.
So that would slow down then the war effort, or you say we go without that?
Well, no, I think the most important thing, while we move to get more information about what might happen in the future, the most important thing is to go back and look at some of these past terrorist incidents and see whether or not we believe there may have been state sponsorship and state involvement in the past. The Clinton administration at first took a look at the idea of Iraqi involvement in the World Trade Center bombing of 1993 and then veered away from it. We need to go back and look at that again closely, because if the Iraqi government was involved in the first World Trade Center attack 8 years ago, there's a chance that Saddam has been sitting over there perhaps with bin Laden and saying, hey, I got away with it the first time, maybe I'll try again.
Mr. Speaker, I want to backtrack and then move forward on the issue of the president's leadership. Juan just mentioned that the president had issued approval to shoot down any aircraft not responding to signals headed toward Washington. What does that tell you about his competence as commander-in-chief?
Well, I think that the president reacted very rapidly. I think the shock of Tuesday, by Wednesday he clearly was moving into a war footing, and by Thursday he had a very clear, articulated general strategy. And I think that the president both emotionally and morally reacted, and I agree with Joe Allbaugh. I can't imagine a stronger ability to lead the country. And the country, by the way, has reacted to that. But in addition, having assembled a team before the crisis that includes Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and Condi Rice and Don Rumsfeld, I can't imagine a group sitting to discuss war that would be a more competent senior group that the United States could assemble in this generation.
Secretary Rumsfeld and others have made the point that we are going to strike back and we've got to take the offensive against terrorism. In order to make that credible, in order to shake up terrorists, how swiftly and how decisively do we need to act?
I think it's more important that we be decisive in our goals. The president has repeatedly said, Colin Powell has repeatedly said, we will not tolerate state-sponsored terrorism. We will not tolerate state-sheltered terrorism. If we communicate that and mean it, then countries like Syria and Iraq and Sudan and Afghanistan and Iran face a real future-deciding decision. I mean, I think second, we have to mobilize our forces, both diplomatically. I think politically, I think we have a very real need to communicate, for example, to the Muslim world that anyone who wants a decent life, anyone who wants prosperity, anyone who wants a chance to have a government that's not ruthless and dictatorial and filled with secret police, we're your allies. We're not we don't oppose Islam. There are more Muslims in the United States than there are Episcopalians. There were American Muslims who died on Tuesday because they were Americans. So I think we want to reach out very strongly. And then I think we have to be prepared to mobilize the American defense capability. As Secretary Powell said, either by ourselves if necessary or with allies when possible, to communicate clearly that we are going to eradicate these overt systems. You can't get the random nut terrorist who's hiding in a basement somewhere, but you can destroy terrorist camps. You can clean up governments that sponsor terrorism. Yes, it's a big project. I think it's a 3 to 5 year campaign, but I don't think this is like the war on drugs. I don't think this is a 20-year hangout, have bureaucrats doing it occasionally. If we're serious, there will be no state-sponsored terrorism on the planet in 3 to 5 years.
All right, Speaker Gingrich, Director Woolsey, thanks for joining us. More than 100 million Americans will have attended religious services from Friday through Sunday, and many are worshiping even now. For more on the resurgence of public religion, we're joined by Steve Santani in Arlington, Virginia, and Brian Kilmeade in New York City. Brian?
Well, Tony, how appropriate that this magnificent cathedral behind me, St. Patrick's Cathedral, that opened its doors just after the Civil War back in the 19th century to offer support, to allow people to mourn and somehow deal with their loss, is asked to do the same thing centuries later after the worst disaster in our nation's history. Yes, tonight at 5:30, a special memorial mass for all those victims, for all the families of the victims, for those lost, for those still hoping to find someone in the rubble. Tonight at 5:30, a special mass for them. Expected on hand over 2,200 people. That's capacity in the seating. But when you think about everyone that could rim around the place, those expected to show up just to be a part of it in the perimeter, expect like 3,000. VIPs on hand, a lot of them, but none more important than Mayor Giuliani. UN officials should be here, government officials, along with state officials. And keep in mind, too, that people will be showing up looking for some answers, looking to mourn, looking for scripture, for some guidance, because very few people do have answers. And when you talk about uniformed police, when you talk about uniformed Port Authority people or those in the fire department, they'll have a special service. That'll be on Monday night, same time. Meanwhile, today, worshiping going on. And, Tony, they ended with singing God Bless America. That usually doesn't happen in church, in Catholic church across the country. It simply came from the heart. It's going on right now. For more on this and what's happening across this country, let me go out to my colleague Steve Centani, standing by in Arlington, Virginia.
Well, Brian, I'm at the Cathedral of St. Thomas More in Arlington, Virginia, where the bishop here, Bishop Paul Laverty, has declared this a weekend of prayer for the victims of the terrorist attack and their families. Now, this is the head of the headquarters of the Archdiocese, or the Diocese of Arlington, which is home to the Pentagon, which is only about a mile away from here. Normally, there are a lot of military men and women who attend services here. Many of them are here today, about 1,000 people attending this service. The bishop, Bishop Laverty, said during the Mass, he asked God to protect us from men of violence and to keep us safe from these diabolical acts of terror. Special services are also set today at the National Cathedral in Washington. That, of course, is where that very moving memorial prayer service was held on Friday. And the leader of Washington area Catholics, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, will say Mass today at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. Tony, back to you.
All right, thank you both. Barbara Olson, a passenger on the jet that exploded into the Pentagon, was the first confirmed fatality in Tuesday's attacks. Many of her friends attended a memorial service Saturday at the Cathedral of Thomas More in Arlington, Virginia. One speaker was her parish priest, the Reverend Franklin Martin McAfee, and here's a portion of his homily.
What we saw with our own eyes is the face of evil. And evil cannot logically be explained because, as those of you who are steeped in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas know, evil, malum, is nihil, is nothing. Since God is existence itself, God told Moses, I am who am, evil would be non-being, nothingness. And to confront nothingness is to come face to face with unspeakable horror. We can, however, understand how people would be compelled to murder with enthusiasm so many people. A terrorist is not born. Terrorists are made.
Barbara was a well-known political activist in Washington and a woman of gloriously varied talents, including great optimism, tenacity, and enterprise. Those talents shined in the final minutes of her life. She phoned her husband, U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson, not once but twice from the doomed jet. He shared some of his recollections Friday with Brit Hume.
On behalf of all of us here, our condolences to you and our best wishes to you, sir.
Thank you.
I know that she called you while that plane that had taken off from Dulles was in the air. Could you describe those conversations?
Yes, there were two conversations. The plane took off at 8:10 in the morning, or that's when it was scheduled to take off, and that's when I believe it took off. I had been in my office at the Department of Justice. Someone told me that there had been the two strikes that occurred at the World Trade Center. I turned on the television set in my office and watched, as I guess all of us did, this tragedy unfold at the World Trade Center. One of the gals in my office came in and said, Barbara's on the phone. I picked up the phone. We spoke for a couple of, maybe a minute or two. It was cut off, and then a few moments later we had another telephone conversation that lasted for 3 or 4 minutes. I was at first relieved to hear Barbara on the telephone because panic strikes immediately. My wife had taken off on a plane. 2 airplanes had crashed into the World Trade Center. I, of course, like any other person, felt potentially devastated, panicky a little bit, and I made a calculation that it couldn't possibly have, that airplane couldn't possibly have gotten to New York, although it could have been close. But then to hear her voice was reassuring and calming. But then her next words out of her mouth were that, Ted, my plane's been hijacked.
Now, was she calm?
She was very calm. She was completely in control of her emotions.
Was she sort of whispering, or was she speaking?
No, she was speaking loud enough that I could hear her. I didn't feel that she was whispering. I said, I asked her a couple of questions, and I'm not sure now the sequence in which I asked those questions, but I learned from her that she had been in first class. She and the other passengers had been herded to the back of the airplane. I asked her whether the hijackers, knew that she was calling, and she said, no, they don't know. She indicated that they had used knives and box cutters to take over the plane. At some point, we got cut off. I immediately called the command center of the Department of Justice to let them know that my wife was on a plane that had been hijacked. I mainly wanted them to know there was another hijacked plane out there. I didn't know whether anyone in...
What did they say when you called them?
They just absorbed the information, and they promised to send someone down right away. I didn't know that I was going to get another call. And I expected them to pass the information on to the appropriate people, and I assumed that they did. A few minutes later, another call came in from Barbara. I found out later that she was having, for some reason, to call collect, and was having trouble getting through. You know how it is to get through a government institution when you're calling
collect call, right? You don't know whether it was on a regular cell phone or one of those air phones?
No, I don't. And I first of all assumed that it must have been on the airplane phone, and that she somehow didn't have access to her credit cards. Otherwise, she would have used her cell phone and called me. So I think that was probably what it was. But Barbara got through a second time, and we exchanged the feelings that a husband and wife who are extraordinarily close as we are, those kind of sentiments. And she assured me everything was going to be okay. I told her in the first conversation that the 2 hijacked planes had hit the World Trade Center, and my impulse was that I had to tell her that. That was the kind of person she was. That's the kind of relationship that we had. I always wonder whether I should have, but her instinct was, what do we do? What shall I tell the pilot? What can I do?
Did she describe the hijackers or say what they'd said or anything like that?
No, only thing that she said with respect to that is that the pilot had announced that the plane had been hijacked. She said it had been hijacked shortly after takeoff. By this time, the plane had been in the air. Again, I'm presuming that it took off on time for over an hour. She implied that they had been circling around for a while. Not long after the second phone call, connection was broken. By what, I don't know. I was watching television in my office both before, after, and during these telephone calls. I began to hear reports of the explosion at the Pentagon, and I knew in my heart that was that aircraft. And I also knew in my heart that she could not possibly have survived that kind of an explosion with a full load of fuel on a recently taken off airplane. I wanted it not to be true. I wanted it not to be her plane. I wanted if it was her plane to have somehow survived because she was back in the airplane, but we know that doesn't happen.
How does someone like you with a relationship so close to someone who is so vibrant, how do you deal with this?
You have to just take it one step at a time. You have to take strength from the people that love you and the people that love Barbara, and the huge number of expressions of sympathy and compassion and support. That has been extremely moving. Barbara wanted to be where things were happening, wanted to have opinions, wanted to express them, wanted to live every moment of her life.
Ted Olson, again, our condolences to you and our great gratitude to you for taking this time at what must be a very difficult time for you indeed. Well, thank you, sir.
Well, thank you for everything that you've done for Barbara and for everyone else.
And we're back with our panel, Brit, Hume, Mara Eliason, Bill Kristol, and Juan Williams. And Brit, as one watches that tape, you get sort of an unfolding sense of nausea. You know how it ends. You don't want it to end that way. And you think of a fellow who's on the phone knowing that it's the last time he'll ever talk to his wife.
Well, I think it was, in his case, obviously particularly painful to know ahead of time and to hear her voice those last 2 times. But, Tony, obviously we need to note here that this these events are multiplied many thousands of times, that the funeral service that we saw yesterday for